Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Nice.
Where's our guest of honor? How y'all doing?
Good.
Fine,
Good.
thank you. Turn on mute.
So, Sarah, I have a Zoom question.
Wait just a sec. Okay, yeah.
Is there a way on the screen to see the face of the person who's speaking rather than the whole class?
Yes, let's see. Okay, if you go up,
Hey,
just
Rachel. Nice to
move
see
your
you.
cursor, right, left, top right corner. And
Hold on.
there's little squares that says view.
Uh-huh.
And choose that, and I think you want speaker view.
There we go. That does it. Because I think that will be helpful to people who are trying to watch this. Oh, Arun's here. Arun? Arun?
He's connecting.
He's still connected. There it is.
Gonna check on Twitter to make sure there's no unexpected encumberment. That was a Frenchism.
Gallicism.
Well, an hour ago, he saw my message and he made a positive emoticon. So how'd you find the reading this week?
It's an excellent book.
Yeah, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So much research.
I want to talk to him about it, so I don't want to say the same things over again. I'll just bore you if I do. I'll just send a message on Twitter. We're all assembled and eager to hear from me. That doesn't sound like I'm nagging. So Arun, it's so kind of you to join us.
Hi, yeah, I decided to check you out, Claire.
Yeah, well, oh, here he is. All right. Oren.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Oren, or good afternoon. Well, no, you're in New York now, right?
I'm in New York. Good afternoon. Sorry to keep you waiting.
No, not at all. Welcome. This is so hotly anticipated. We're all so excited to hear from you.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you for putting this together.
So I don't know whether to start with congratulations or condolences, but I think I'll say congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Oren got married on October 7th.
I did.
Oh.
I did. Yeah, ooh, is right.
Congrats. Yeah, mistletoe.
All right, I don't want to hog the session this time because Oren's really here to talk to us, but I just want to ask Oren, I have just a quick question, then I'll turn it over to everyone else. When did you realize that you were sitting on these documents that no one had written about before?
Well, I realized quite early that no one had really written about this topic properly before. There was no general interest history of this period of the revolt and everything that emanated from it. And then it was, and that was my strong feeling at the beginning. And then as I submitted my proposal to publisher after publisher and agent after agent, all of whom rejected it, I thought, okay,
Really?
maybe I misjudged something. But ultimately it worked out. But certainly the most valuable, some of the most fascinating documents that I found in this process were those secret Peel
Yeah,
Commission
that's what I meant.
testimonies.
That's
If that's
what I
what you're talking about. And those I have to give thanks to a Professor Stephen Wagner in the UK who found the documents, but he didn't have time to read them. And I asked if I could see them, and it was remarkable.
I would have thought their
it's-
declassification would result in a stampede. Why were
Well-
they classified then?
Because, well, the British very quietly declassified them, silently declassified them in 2017, 80 years after they were put together.
Is that an 80-year rule of some kind?
Yeah, well, so as I understand it, the most sensitive material, I believe, is released after 80 years. Most material is released after 40 years, is my understanding.
30 years.
Yeah, I think it was 50, and then they reduced it to 40. Again, Professor Wagner has a habit of every now and then just going in and seeing what they've released, just taking a look at the list of what they've declassified, and so I have to give him my thanks for finding them. But it's hundreds of pages, and I've only probably read maybe 10% of them.
Were you the first person he called, or did he call a whole bunch of researchers?
Well, he gave them to a professor in Canada named Layla Parsons.
Mhm.
And she wrote an academic article about one or two of the testimonies, and then I thought I need to see the rest of them. So the testimony from Lloyd George, nobody had read that, as far as I know.
And you knew you wanted to work on this topic before finding those papers.
Sorry?
And you knew you wanted to work on this topic before.
Oh yeah. I found those papers well into the process. I started. I was several years into this process when I found those documents. Yeah.
But I mean, from a historical point of view, finding those must have felt like winning the jackpot. I mean,
again, at the risk of sounding as if I'm self-pitying or something, my first article on Lloyd George, I was like, check this out. They're asking him, this is the prime minister under whom the Balfour Declaration was issued, and now they're asking him, in the most candid atmosphere possible, why did you do this, right? And both the witness, Lloyd George, and the commissioners were under the expectation that these documents were going to be burned afterwards, they're going to be destroyed. So they're speaking completely candidly. And I wrote the article, and it kind of landed with a thud, and nobody noticed. And I thought, am I going crazy? Is this not a big deal? But eventually, there was more recognition that this is in fact a big deal.
Probably there was snobbery among the book reviewers because you're not a historian proper. They didn't realize.
Well, I'm not an academic. I concede that fully, and even proudly sometimes. No, just kidding. No offense. I don't have a PhD. I have a master's. I'm a journalist and a think tanker and an analyst. So that secret testimony from Lloyd George about the origins of the Balfour Declaration, and the secret testimony from Herbert Samuel, which I wrote about just recently, just a few months ago, didn't actually make it into the book, in which they asked him, this was the first High Commissioner for Palestine, right? And he was a Jew, he was a Zionist. And they asked, and he was the guy who appointed Amin al-Husseini to be Grand Mufti. It's one of the most momentous decisions in the history of the Jewish-Arab conflict. And they asked him, why did you do this? So both of those two testimonies, I think, are just so revealing and just so important. I was very, very happy to write about both of them. And when we put out a paperback edition of the book next year, I'm going to incorporate them into the book because they didn't make it in.
For the benefit of everyone who doesn't know, why did he appoint him?
So his own justification for it is rather underwhelming. He strikes a very defensive tone. He basically says that no one else in Palestine had the necessary qualifications, which is complete nonsense. Amin was 24, 25 years old. He was not a particularly impressive religious scholar by any stretch. He had spent very little time at Al-Azhar, the seminary in Egypt. The main reason, which Samuel alludes to but doesn't say explicitly, is that they needed to give a prize to the Husseini family because other big families had already gotten their prizes. And the Husseini family had, for whatever reason, rallied around this young guy. And he didn't feel, for the peace of Palestine, he didn't feel that he could do otherwise. Also, he was getting advice from some fiercely anti-Zionist members of the Palestine administration who were pushing Amin because they understood even then what kind of man he was.
Really? How do you know that?
That they knew what kind of man he was, or that he was pushed by them?
All of that.
Well, there's a man out. I'm happy to send you the link to my. I wrote a piece for the Times of Israel about Herbert Samuel's secret testimony, and there's a man, a Palestine administration official by the name of Ernest Richmond, who is the most bitter foe in the Palestine administration of the Zionist project, and he pushes more than anybody else, and that's quite clear. And Samuel even alludes to that in the testimony, without mentioning Richmond by name. Yeah.
Why was he a bitter foe of the Zionist project?
Why was he a bitter? He was very much an Arabist. He was an Arabic speaker. He was an architect and an antiquity. He headed the Palestine Antiquities Authority after he actually quit in disgust from the administration because of its Zionist policy. He said, I find this policy to be evil. I can't be part of it. And they made him head of the Antiquities Authority. He was, if memory serves, I think he was Catholic, and he was a very devout Catholic, and I think he found some sort of that inspired his anti-Semitism in some way on a theological basis. Yeah, that's the short version. This was like a 5,000 word piece, which I encourage all of you to read if you're interested, because it's the only time that I've found that Herbert Samuel is asked, why did you appoint this guy? I think this is perhaps the most significant decision at least in the early mandate. I mean, everything could have been different if they had appointed someone else in that position.
Very anti-Zionist, certainly they all were, but arguably anti-Semitic, and lived for a long time, and it affected things all the way up through, probably up through he may have died during the Second World War, but he lived for a long time during this period.
I'm sorry,
He was
Kelly?
appointed by the British government.
Kelly, are you talking to us?
I'm sorry, I was talking to someone else in the room. I apologize.
I was confused by that.
Didn't mean to disrupt the meeting. Sorry.
Not at all.
That's okay. Now I'm wondering who you're talking about now.
All right. So, yeah, I am too, actually.
My wife was sitting in the corner here, and I was explaining to her who the Mufti was and his.
Okay. Yeah.
So she didn't quite pick up on that to begin with. Apologize for disrupting the.
Not at all. I was just confused.
Not at all.
Do that.
Oren, usually when you publish a book by this point, it's been out since April, right?
Since April in the UK, but it came out in the States in February.
Right. By this point, you've done so many of these podcasts that you can do the whole thing in your sleep, right? And you're super articulate because you know it all by heart. But this class is different because everyone's read it and everyone's done the preliminary reading as well. So I really want to give everyone here a chance to ask the questions that I don't know the answers to, because this period so much better. How did everyone like the book?
Oh, it was great.
Thank you, Meredith.
I felt like I was in the room.
It was terrific. I'm a big fan of Margaret Macmillan's, and 1919 covers this in a much more superficial way because it had to be. But her maps were good, and it's all about people.
Yep, it's all about people. That's really done well. It's wonderful narrative, wonderfully evocative.
Thank you, Claire.
What came as a surprise?
Oh, so much. What came as a surprise? I do feel that there were so many points at which things could have gone differently.
Yes.
You already mentioned the appointment of well, now we call him the Mufti. The appointment of, he wasn't even known as Haj Amin at the time because he didn't even really deserve, this young guy Amin al-Husseini as the Grand Mufti. This was a huge crossroads at which things could have gone very differently. Sorry?
Was he a Haji at that point?
I mean, the very fact that he used this epithet of Hajj, right? This honorific. It's not that much of an honorific. I mean, if he were a real religious scholar, and I read about this in my article, he would have been called a sheikh. And there were they actually, I didn't mention this, but they had an election. Herbert Samuel held an election for Mufti, and the great and the good of Arab Palestine voted, and Amin came in fourth. and then due to the various maneuverings of Richmond and others, they shoehorned him in. But he didn't have the religious credentials to be a sheikh, and so he kind of grabbed this sort of middling honorific of Hajj. I mean, it wasn't that unusual. It really wasn't. It was fairly common for children of wealthy Arab families to make the Hajj to Mecca. It wasn't something to brag about, but that's kind of all he had. So this is so that's one just tremendous what if point, one tremendous crossroads where things could have gone differently. You know, in 1937, when the British come up with the partition plan, what if that had been accepted, right?
Yeah, that's a massive what if moment.
It's a huge what if. What if there were a small Jewish state in 1937 that could have accepted hundreds of thousands of Jews from Europe? Right? What if the white paper hadn't been passed in 1939? What if the Palestinian Arabs had thrown the Mufti into the dustbin of history after he allied with Hitler in World War II? Perhaps there would have been no Palestinian refugee crisis. Perhaps Gaza wouldn't be teeming with refugees today. It's so all of these kind of what ifs, I think, were very very intriguing, and yeah.
One of the things I notice about this period is the British seem to be confused about what precisely their imperial interest is. With the Balfour Declaration, they seem to be under the impression that it would be very good to have the Jews in their corner because the Jews are so powerful and have friends in the US, and you know, they'd have a real Western outpost at the heart of a significant trade route. And then they changed their mind and say it would be a good idea to have the Arabs in our corner. There's a lot more Arabs than Jews, and we have all these Muslims in India. When I read the papers, I get the sense the British are superb administrators. They're so good at this. I mean, obviously it's a very difficult job, but they're so careful and they're so thoughtful. How come they didn't have the overall strategic picture worked out?
I think I'd agree with that. I think they are very effective administrators. They're supremely organized. I mean, just the amount of paperwork that they produced in 30 years in Palestine is just astonishing.
Yeah, it was good paperwork too.
And daunting for the historian. Yeah.
Some of
it's quite good.
Yeah,
exactly. Many of you have read the Peel Commission. It's actually a very good read.
Yeah.
But I do think we sometimes overestimate the amount of planning that actually went into a lot of this stuff. I mean, we have this idea of you know, this great empire, the greatest empire in the world, and that they knew exactly what they were doing. Well, the Balfour Declaration was issued in the heat and fog of war. There were all kinds of competing motivations, competing interests, a lot of moving parts, different officials doing different things. And of course, communication wasn't the same in 1917 as it is today. And so, but that's the Balfour Declaration. But with the mandate, you do get the sense again and again that the British aren't quite sure what they're doing, and there's probably, if there was any kind of consensus, and there wasn't, but your average Brit, I think, who was serving in Palestine would have been, shall we say, skeptical of the whole Zionist project. There was a minority that was sort of more sympathetic, but most of them, I think, my sense is, found it to be a distraction. They found it to be harmful to British interests. It just simply wasn't worth incurring the wrath of millions of Muslims in the empire, which is not even to speak of, you know, violence within Palestine.
Yeah.
And so, so I think there wasn't one clear message or intention there.
You know who really evoked the mindset of the British at the time? Have you read Bernard Wasserstein on Britain and the Jews of Europe?
I've read his book about the British in Palestine.
Right. I haven't read that, but Britain and the Jews of Europe is it's a devastating book. It's absolutely devastating. The British were well aware of the Nazis' intentions and still wouldn't permit the emigration to Palestine. And he has a lot of archival material that just suggests this kind of, well, anti-Semitism. There's no other word for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what else struck me? The Ottomans really just completely disappear, don't they? They just disappear. I mean, how is it possible that having ruled over this land for 400 years, no one, after they leave, no one talks about them, no one asks their advice, no one asks them to mediate?
Yeah.
That's strange.
Yeah. Well, let me round off your question about the British for a moment as well. I do think there was this idea of fair play, and the idea that the British had made this promise of the Balfour Declaration in the eyes of the world, and whether they liked it or not, they had to just get on with it. I'm a bit of an Anglophile myself, so perhaps I'm a little bit biased, but there was this idea that whether we like it or not, this is what we have to do because we've said we're going to do it. In terms of the Ottomans, I would agree with you completely. They were running the show, and then one day they weren't, and they were sort of forgotten. I think even in the best of times in the Ottoman era, it was a pretty bare bones affair. They were, I mean, other than accepting bribes, demanding and accepting bribes, they weren't really felt much of the time, particularly in the waning decades of the Ottoman Empire. And so I think, at least in the initial period, certainly the Jews, but also many Arabs in Palestine were quite happy to be rid of them. They were seen as corrupt, as incompetent, as barely felt. And so, yeah. So
this is not
in
how
that
the
sense,
Turks remember things.
Sorry?
Needless to say, this isn't how the Turks remember things.
Yeah, I mean, you listen to Erdogan, and you think it was a golden period in Palestine when everyone had equal rights and the flowers were in bloom. Well, no, it was a neglected corner. It was a neglected corner of a dying empire, and it was never given much thought. It was barely invested in. Even the railroads that sprung up in the Holy Land were built by German companies for the most part, and then vastly expanded by the British when they arrived. The most that the Ottomans did, and this is of course a simplification. I don't claim expertise in the Ottoman era, but the clock towers are the main thing, the main the most visible remnant of the Ottoman past. As you go to Jaffa, you see the clock tower that they put up to celebrate the jubilee of the Sultan.
What about the property deeds?
They did keep quite good property records, because there was money to be made there. There were bribes to be had. That is true, but there was it was a land that was a backwater, that much of which was malarial, much of which was desertified, and it was not somewhere that any of us, I think, Ottoman Palestine was not a great place to live, is my sense.
It lives so large in Erdogan's imagination, and it's frustrating to have written this book, and I'm sure, and to not be able to get him to read it.
Well, then one wonders why the Arabs revolted against the Turks. Now, of course, not they all didn't, but the Arab Revolt of World War I was widely popular among the Arabs, even though, of course, they shared a religion with the Ottomans. So one wonders, if things were so great, why they were so keen, at least at first, on the Turks being replaced by the Brits.
Yeah. Who else doesn't seem to have a very good handle on this history is Netanyahu. Was I mistaken to think that he recited the conspiracy theory that Haj Amin al-Husseini was actually the man who inspired the Holocaust?
Yeah, it's really, I mean, Haj Amin is such a negative character. It's really unnecessary to embellish. I mean, this is a guy who, if history had panned out slightly differently, would have been tried as a war criminal after the war.
He did say that, didn't he?
He did say that. He said that he planted this idea of the final solution in Hitler's mind, in the Nazis' mind. It's of course untrue, but he did know about the final solution, and he clearly didn't lose any sleep over it. He tried in his small way probably to speed it along. He certainly opposed each and every effort to send even a handful of Jews to Palestine. He opposed it. He did everything he could to stop it. He of course helped recruitment efforts of Muslims in Bosnia. He writes in his memoirs, in his Arabic memoirs, that Himmler told him quite clearly that X million of that this many Jews had already been killed at a certain point in the war, and he states that without any kind of comment. He clearly admires Himmler, who he met with several times. Of course, famously, he met with Hitler. I think once. Yeah, so there's really no need to embellish that record. This is it's an appalling record by any stretch.
Okay, one more question. I don't want to hog it, but I just have one last question. Am I right to think that apart from Al-Qassam and Husseini, there really isn't much by way of jihadist rhetoric at the street level, at the popular level during this period? That is much more it's much more nationalist than it is Islamist.
It's a lot of it is religiously infused, but Amin was such a central presence. He so set the tone that it's almost hard to imagine what things would have been like had he not been there. And at least from 1928 on, culminating infamously in the 1929 Hebron massacres, which recall 10/7, October 7th, and how grim and gruesome they were. Yeah. Starting in 1928, he really launches this Al-Aqsa campaign, and this idea, which is still very much with us 100 years later, that Al-Aqsa is in danger, that the Jews are planning to blow it up and build their temple. And this is really the backdrop to the 1929 riots in Hebron and elsewhere, and so much that has come since. There was, I think, Arab nationalism at that point was in many ways infused with kind of a lot of Islamic imagery and rhetoric, but you're right. There were quite a few prominent Christians who were involved as well, and it wasn't explicitly jihadi by any. It wasn't, other than Qassam, and then towards the end of his career, Haj Amin. It wasn't jihadi in the sense that we would recognize it today. It was more protecting the Muslim holy places and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I found that very interesting. Look, I don't want to keep everyone else from having a chance to ask. Arun, I'm going to call on you. Arun used to teach this class, and I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts, Arun, about why it is that this period has been so neglected?
Why it has been so neglected? Why, by historians?
Yeah,
I'm not a historian. I can't really speak to that. One remark I will make is I'm thinking of you talked about what Haj Amin Hosseini was saying about the blowing up of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is really important. I read an article quite some time ago by Ilan Pape before he went off the rails, when he was a good historian in the early 90s, about this, and about the campaign that the Haj Amin, when it was, I think, in 1925, he went to South Asia and he publicized. He was raising money to refurbish, and to repaint the Mosque of Omar, the Dome of the Rock, and of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And he traveled throughout South Asia, what is today India and Pakistan, and he publicized also what he believed the Zionists were up to. And this is the fundamental mistake that the Haj Amin and also the Palestinians, the Arabs of Palestine, made at the time, is they believed that Zionism was a purely religious enterprise.
Did they?
And that the goal of the Zionists was to, yes. Well, this is Ilan Pape wrote. I mean, I'm basing this on a very good article. I think it dates from 1994, based on archival material, where that they believe that the Zionists, that it was religious, and that they wanted to destroy the mosque of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and of the Haram al-Sharif and rebuild the third temple. And they saw Zionism purely in religious terms. And this was what, and this gained resonance throughout the Muslim world because of Haj Amin Hosseini, his travels, again, to South Asia, and I guess, probably elsewhere in the Arab world as well, elsewhere in the Muslim world. And they fundamentally misunderstood what Zionism was about. I mean, obviously there was a religious part of it,
Right.
but that was not exclusively what it was. And as we know, the original Zionists were not religious. So
That is a profound misunderstanding, and it suggests very little contact with the people who were the communities so isolated from each other that they didn't have the chance to really appreciate what these people.
Well, I think that was absolutely the case, but that went on both sides. I mean, the Zionists made no effort at all to interact with the Arabs.
Yes, as the British
They did not learn
administrators
Arabic. Listen, I mean, it was on both sides. The lack of contact and the miscomprehension, if you will.
But Oren, you point to some important relationships. So Ben Gurion's with what was his name?
Musa Alami, yeah.
Alami. But it really says something important that they understood Zionism in purely religious terms. Is that something you'd agree with, Oren?
There were exceptions. I think someone like Musa Alami had a more nuanced, complete understanding. Not that he agreed with it, but a more understanding of what the Jews, the Zionists, were trying to do. But I think in general there was a real resistance on the Arab side to see the Jews as a people. There was this kind of Ottoman Muslim conception of the Jews as a religious group, as dhimmi, as people of the book, and they were protected more or less as long as they accepted their subservient status under Islam, but they were a religious group like the Christians.
Right.
I think there was there was real difficulty and real resistance in seeing it as a nationalist movement, let alone a legitimate one.
Because the narrative now is settler colonialism. That's the go-to narrative. They were settler colonists, and that's why I'm surprised. Arun?
No, I just want to say, first of all, the dhimmi system that was finished in the mid-19th century. That's not but it is absolutely true that the Arabs, the Palestinians, to this day refuse to see the Jews as a nation. For Palestinians, and this is primordial, Jews are a religious community, period. And the notion of Jews as a nation, disconnected from religion, is just something that the Palestinian movement across the board has rejected. And so I just wanted to make that comment, and that because for the Jews to be accepted as a nation, that means accepting the legitimacy of Zionism. And Palestinians, and that includes the PLO, that includes Fatah. They won't do that.
And Claire, you mentioned this paradigm of settler colonialism, which we're all bombarded with these days on everywhere. It would have been quite surprising, I think, to many of the people of the time to hear that it's actually the Jews who are the settler colonialists. Certainly, there were Arabs who felt that that there was something colonial in the enterprise, but if anything, it was very clear who the imperial power was, and that was the British. And the fact that a few years after the Arab Revolt, there's an even fiercer Jewish revolt in the mid and late 1940s would make it a rather strange form of colonialism. Of course, the Jews didn't have a metropole. There was no Jewish empire that was settling Jews in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was very clear that the British were the imperial power, even though they were acting on behalf of the League of Nations, the sort of international community of the time. But it was this kind of strange hybrid in which the imperial power was settling another people in that land. But it clearly doesn't fit neatly into, this isn't the British sending convicts to Australia or settling the 13 colonies. It's a very different dynamic.
All right, I want to give everyone a chance to ask questions. So I'm going to start. Rachel, what did you learn from the book? What questions do you have?
Where's Rachel?
Upper left corner for me.
Oh, I'm here. I'm still digesting it, and until I've had some time to really write out my notes, I'm not sure. I need more time to just sit with it and think it over.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I have a related question to what we just discussed. I was always surprised by this rhetoric of colonialism applied to Israel. As far as I understood, and please correct me if I'm wrong, all the land that Israel acquired until its independence was legitimately bought in a fair exchange, right?
So a certain proportion of the land that became the state of Israel had been bought and paid for. I'm forget the exact number, but it was a minority of the land was bought and paid for, but land, right? It was significant, but it wasn't a majority of the land. Also, don't forget that half the country is desert, right? Which was basically not owned by anybody. But the Ottomans had different categories of land sales. There was land that was considered dead land. There was land that was basically considered property of the Sultan, and so quite a bit of it. And so it's not sort of the American model or it's not that every acre of land was owned by somebody. It wasn't that simple. But certainly a huge part of the Zionist enterprise was buying land. I mean, the entire Jezreel Valley was bought in the 1920s, for example. It was a huge land purchase. And so, and you can see maps of kind of the growth of Zionist owned land. But yeah, you know, I write about this in the book that almost every leading Arab family was selling land to Jews, every single one. And most of the Arab executive of Palestine, these individuals, the vast majority, most of them were selling land as well, because the land was commanding very inflated prices. The Jews were willing to pay very inflated prices for what was often swampy, low-grade land that they then intended to improve. Hajj Amin, there's not much you can say to his credit, but I can say this: he never sold an inch of land, as far as I can tell.
That's not to his credit either.
You know, he had, as we'd say these days, as the kids say, he had his own truth. He was consistent. But yeah, certainly members of the Husseini family, prominent members, were selling land. The mayor of Gaza sold land. I think he was a Husseini. I'd have to check. Yeah, it was very, very common. It was very common for these people to be railing against land sales in public while quite happily doing it in private. Yeah.
But I guess
you had a question about the landholding class. Do you remember what it was? This just reminded me of about it. You said something. Who were these landholders? Is that what you asked?
I'm sorry, who are you talking to?
Karina.
Yeah. I actually, like, when he mentioned that most of the wealthy Arab, like the big Arab landowners were selling, I was like, oh, that's an answer to my question last week. So yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. There are records from the Zionist side in which, and they were also quite meticulous record keepers of who sold which land, and you can find every major family and many of the leading Arab nationalists are on that list, and you can see exactly how much was paid and where. Yeah. So there's a great book called The Land Question in Palestine by Professor Kenneth Stein, which I think is kind of the authoritative book on this question.
So would you say that the claim of stolen land would be incorrect, counterfactual?
Broadly speaking, I would say it's incorrect because very much of this land was paid for quite handsomely. Not all of it.
1948 yet.
It was incorrect before 1948, not after.
That's what I mean. Yeah, that
right.
I was. Yeah,
So,
I understand.
I think a lot of things having to do with the 1948 war. It was sort of very hyper local and different. There are all these questions about what happened in 48, were the Palestinians expelled, did they flee, and it really matters where you look. And there were different dynamics in different places. So there's a significant amount of land that was bought. There's another many significant chunks of land in the country where in 48 the Arabs fled, and then it became, or in certain places were expelled. That's a whole different. You can talk to Benny Morris, and that's a whole different topic. And then the state of Israel came into this land that it had never bought because it was inhabited by Arabs. So there's different there's not a simple answer to the question. I think it's historically incorrect to say the land was stolen because many millions of pounds were made off of these land sales. Yeah, it's complicated, like so many things in this conflict.
Thank you.
Eric, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. I would be interested if Oren could elaborate a little bit on the Arabs who were willing to accept the Peel Commission partition plan and how it is they were sort of overwhelmed, because that sort of disunity and their lack of getting their act together seems to be it seems to exist today as well. I mean, there's sort of a lack of leadership, shall we say.
Let me just add a little to that question, because this has been on my mind too. What do we know about the reputation of this group of Arabs? Did they have a reputation prior to this as being people who couldn't stop fighting?
Just the Arabs of Palestine generally?
Yeah. Are they fractious in historic memory?
Yeah, well, you can look at the British sort of some of the most fascinating documents are the British intelligence documents when they first take over the country at the end of World War I, and they're trying to figure out what is this land that they've just inherited. And there are documents in which they kind of profile the various families and who's feuding with whom, and they basically paint a picture, yes, of a fractious society in which you have, even in this early stage, when the British first arrive in 1917, the two main poles are the Husseinis, of which, of course, the Mufti is a part, and the Nashashibis. So, and each of them has their allied families. And the Nashashibi camp was generally considered more moderate, more willing to work with the British and with the Jews. That's not to suggest that they were Zionist by any stretch, but they recognized the benefits that the Jews were bringing economically and otherwise. And that the mandate was bringing, that the British presence was bringing in terms of economics, sanitation, transportation, and many different things. And so yeah, it's a great question about the Peel Commission. And so the Nashashibi camp accepted the partition plan, and there were Nashashibi allied mayors in major cities across Palestine. I think the mayor of Nablus was a Nashashibi, the mayor of Jaffa, Haifa, and all of these members of the Nashashibi camp accepted the partition plan, as did Emir Abdullah in Transjordan, who was also considered sort of Nashashibi aligned. But once the Mufti came out, they accepted it privately. They told the British, they signaled to the British that they accepted it. But once the Mufti came out with his complete and total unequivocal repudiation of this plan, they very quickly fell in line and denied that they had ever been in favor. So again, it raised this question, well, what if a member of the Nashashibis had been made Grand Mufti and head of the Supreme Muslim Council back in the early 1920s by Sir Herbert Samuel? The Nashashibi camp accepted the white paper. Almost all of Arab Palestine accepted the white paper, but the Mufti did not. So I don't want to take the easy way out and pin everything on one man. That's rarely how history works. But I think it's fair to say.
But in this case, it does seem he had an outsized.
Let's pin 75% of it on the Mufti.
Yeah. How well do ordinary Palestinians, understand this part of the history? Is this something that most people would know about?
Not very well. I quote in the book, a professor in Israel by the name of Mustafa Kabha, who's at the Open University of Israel, and he has written probably more than anyone in Arabic and Hebrew and English on, certainly in Arabic, he's written more than anyone on this revolt, and it's significant that he's based in Israel proper and not in the territories. And he writes that basically the revolt has been marginalized and sidelined in the Palestinian narrative, the Palestinian self-conception. The Nakba is so central to the Palestinian self-conception, and it's much dealing with 36 to 39, in his words, and I agree, requires much more soul searching. Right? This requires Palestinians to explain to themselves why so much Arab blood was shed by their fellow Arabs, their fellow Palestinians, whereas dealing with the Nakba or remembering the Nakba is much easier because they view themselves as the victims. They were victimized by the Jews and the Brits and their fellow Arabs who didn't come to their rescue. And so I think the symbols and the heroes of the revolt, quite a few of them are still present. Qassam, whose death in many ways sparked the revolt, is of course very present. The Hamas armed wing calls itself the Qassam Brigades. There are other armed leaders who are very much remembered, but in a kind of nebulous way. There's not a real reckoning with what happened.
And there certainly doesn't seem to be a sense that there are lessons from history that ought to be learned here.
I think the Palestinian narrative very much focuses on the first phase of the revolt, and if at all, namely the first 6 months, in which it was very much more unified uprising, and the general strike, the boycott that marked the beginning of the revolt, I think remains a big source of pride. And even in 2021, when there was a day-long strike during that Gaza war across the Palestinian territories and the Arabs of Israel, there was a lot of hearkening back to this earlier strike. So it's a selective memory, but the infighting, the score settling, that marked so much of the latter phase of the revolt is just basically forgotten.
Well, taking pride in the strike strikes me as an example of taking pride in resistance for its own sake without evaluating whether it was something that worked. And the strike ended up being catastrophic for them.
Well, the revolt in general ended up being catastrophic, but before it ended up in catastrophe, it brought them very significant gains.
Yeah, got them the white paper.
Yes, exactly, the white paper. This is the undeniable achievement, the single most undeniable achievement of the Arab Revolt, and there were celebrations across Arab Palestine when the white paper was issued. They never expected the British to roll back the Zionist project quite so far, and they wouldn't have if not for the exigencies of the World War that everyone expected was on the way. But again, that ended up being for naught, because the Mufti rejected it anyway from his exile at this point, and then the World War began. That said, the white paper was kept in force for a decade, really. But yes, in the end, as I write in the book, the revolt to crush Zionism ends up crushing the Arabs of Palestine themselves. I mean, the entire social fabric is torn. Thousands of people are dead. The elite flees the country. This is an obvious precursor to 1948. Just tremendous amounts of bad blood within Arab society. 100 Arabs are hanged, many more killed by the British, many more still killed by their fellow Arabs. Huge numbers of weapons confiscated. So really, at the risk of a spoiler alert here, one of the main takeaways of the book is that that in many ways the final reckoning, the final showdown between Jews and Arabs in the Holy Land that we see in 47, 48 is really won by one side and lost by another a decade in advance, when this revolt is kind of wrestled to the ground finally in 39 as the World War begins. One side is ready for that and very cohesive, and the other side is just completely shattered, and they never quite.
As you mentioned in the book, it was an opportunity for the Jews to become self-sufficient economically and to replace Arabs in port and in other aspects of trade and commerce, and that's a loss for the Arabs and a great gain for the Jews. And then, you can answer another question for me. I find the British decision to deputize the Jews militarily and send them out to help quell the revolt just incomprehensible, given everything else they're trying to do. I mean, surely that's the last thing you should do if your big problem is these two people hate each other.
They did it quite reluctantly, but there was no other choice.
Like a manpower shortage?
Exactly. This was already 37, 38. They find themselves unable to quell the revolt. The war clouds are gathering over Europe. It seems to be a question of when and not if war with Hitler is going to erupt. That seems to be clear to everyone, if not perhaps everyone except Neville Chamberlain. And so they reluctantly agree to this longstanding Jewish plea to arm and train them in large numbers. And that's exactly what happens. They create something called the Jewish supernumerary police. And in this mechanism, through this mechanism, 15 to 20,000 Jews are armed and trained and often paid by the British. This is still the preeminent military power in the world in this period. But it's clear to everyone that that these Jews are ultimately answerable to the Haganah, to the main Jewish armed group in this period, which is still technically illegal, but the Brits generally tolerate it as long as it behaves itself. And so really and this is completely forgotten, including by Israelis. I think Israelis still have a certain anti-British, particularly older Israelis have a certain residual sort of anti-British attitude. And it's understandable in many ways because of the white paper and other things, but it's, it has to be said that the British sowed the seeds for a Jewish army. The British, this is the period in which the Haganah goes from a loose network of glorified night watchmen to the seed of a Jewish army, and it's all through British. Not all, but it's much of it. The majority of it is through this British facilitation, British arms, British money, British training. Those of you who have reached chapter 5 in the book will know the name Ord Wingate, this very eccentric British officer who has a habit of welcoming guests in the nude and has a habit of eating onions like apples, oftentimes in the nude. And he's a devout Christian, and he's a devout Zionist, which sets him apart from almost all of his comrades in the British Army and the British administration in Palestine. But most important of all, he's a military genius, and he creates these units, which I'm sure many of you have read about, the Special Night Squads, mixed Jewish-British units that operate at night and take the fight to the enemy. And this is really the first Jewish special forces, and this is the core of the future IDF leadership. These are men like Moshe Dayan and Yigal Allon. And so in all of these ways, as you mentioned, Claire, the Jews of the time, the Zionist leadership led by David Ben-Gurion, even in this period, is really expert at turning adversity into advantage. And despite all the pain of this revolt, and it's real pain, 500 Jews are killed in this revolt. These are numbers we wouldn't see until the Second Intifada. Despite that real pain, they make gains, huge gains militarily, politically. This whole idea of a Jewish state, a two-state solution, emerges in this period from the Peel Commission. And as you mentioned, Claire, economically, the Ben-Gurion sees the revolt as a tremendous source of leverage to reach his long-standing goal of creating a self-sufficient Jewish economy that can employ itself, feed itself, house itself, defend itself without any help from the Arabs and without any help from the British. As you mentioned, this is when Tel Aviv port opens. I'm sure some those of you who have been to Israel have probably had a coffee or a beer at Tel Aviv port. This is the period in which the British allow the Jews to open their outlet to the world because the Arab porters in Jaffa are striking. So yeah, so it really serves the interests in the end, despite the pain of the Jews, and very much harms the Arab interest.
Was in the archives, did you find evidence that the British were agonizing about this decision? I mean, surely they knew once we start arming the Jews, there's no hope of any kind of reconciliation between these two people.
Not really. I didn't because I think the Haganah was extremely effective. The Haganah clung to this policy of havlaga in this period, self-restraint, and they got a lot of flack for it from the Irgun and other more right-wing militant Zionist organizations. The policy was, in most cases, do not respond to Arab attacks. Let the British handle it. We will show the British that we're responsible, that we can be trusted with weapons. And it worked beautifully because despite the Irgun, of course, the revisionist armed group in the revisionist armed Zionist group never agreed to this. They had a very different very different policy. Their policy was much more an eye for an eye, and if the Arabs set bombs in our markets, we'll lay bombs in theirs. But the Haganah was able to prove to the British that they could be trusted, and so no, I didn't encounter that much agonizing and soul searching. I think there was, and I think there is a maybe a tendency to read history backwards, but I think a lot of Brits at this time expected the mandate would last for decades longer. And you know, if the Jews will be our allies, they will help us secure the country, but we'll remain in charge. I think that was the idea.
I apologize. I didn't see those hands up in the upper left corner because I had.
Sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, you're not talking too much. You're here for that. I was just looking at the other screen, so I didn't see you. Let's go in turn. James.
Oh, I see Tom and James there. Yeah.
Yeah, and Andre.
Thanks very much. And I'm not entirely through the book by any means, but it's fantastic. And it's a period that the last I studied was years ago in Hebrew day school. So it's really interesting going back. I just want to ask you, and the last thing is what you were just talking about. It's interesting to see the elements right now, meaning the settlers, etc. So the parts that, as you were saying, that represent Jabotinsky, Irgun, etc., that want to take things into their own hands versus the other elements, which, as you were saying, are trying to basically comply with the law. I want to ask you about the partition because I find the partition really interesting, and as Claire said to us at the beginning, I thought it was a great thing. It's all about the maps, and so I'm thinking about the times when there has been attempts at partition. I mean, we just went through the Oslo process, and I watched an amazing PBS documentary from 2002 on the Oslo process, where they basically went through and they got very close. In fact, unfortunately, after the second Intifada, broke out, in trying, at least for the negotiators, getting very close to trying to come to some sort of compromise. So let's go back to 1937 or whatever, because from what I was reading and that stuff, it was a surprise for Ben Gurion that they were offering a state, not just a canton, but it basically elevated to a state. So can you talk about how the partition and the borders were set, please? And it's fascinating because, as I said, then you get 47 and we're going to be back there again, right? Like, I mean, it's a two-state solution, which is unfathomable for people who want Israel to be a democracy. So anyhow, I just wanted you to comment on the partition process and how they came to that and how they started setting the boundaries and trying to get some sort of traction. Because it's interesting to hear you said that there was acceptance of some of those partition boundaries and that stuff. Anyhow, I'll let you go.
Yeah, it's Ben Gurion and Chaim Weizmann and the other the Zionist leaders were thrilled and surprised, of course, with the obvious exception of Jabotinsky and some other opponents. But the sort of mainstream Zionist leadership of Ben Gurion and Weizmann were completely thrilled, although they played coy, with this idea of a Jewish state. They did not expect that this would be the outcome of the Peel Commission at all. They were quite worried when the Peel Commission first arrived. And you asked about how they arrived at this notion of a Jewish state with everything that means, and it's quite. I try to show in the book that it's, again, getting back to this idea that imperial planners are often not these Machiavellian puppeteers, but rather they're human beings like the rest of us, and they were, a lot of these decisions were made quite hastily and quite quickly, oftentimes by mid-level officials. And I don't want to spoil too much of the book for those who haven't read it, but some of these major decisions that have massive repercussions till today were made, in a 20-minute, 30-minute discussion with mid-level officials. A lot of these, even this whole partition plan was kind of cobbled together partition proposal rather was cobbled together quite quickly as the commission was wrapping up its work. They wanted to be able to offer something concrete. And so it's really fascinating stuff to see how these decisions are made, some of which are agonized over for weeks, and then some of which just come together very, very quickly.
James, is your question more technical? How did they choose?
It is. I wanted to actually, yeah, thank you so much, Claire. I find the thing of boundaries, right? Because I saw the maps. In fact, were there 3 options or something like this, as I understood it, or something?
There were,
and so,
yeah.
and it's interesting, lastly, it's always about Jerusalem, right? And that's exactly what Barak was facing with, with Camp David, etc. But more importantly, it was about the swaps. So anyhow, yeah, I just wanted to find out, they knew they were going to have to displace people. I guess the Jewish part was more in the Galilee, etc. And all these, yeah, I just wanted you to comment on the boundaries, how they set the boundaries, how much they invited the parties in to try and set the boundaries to get a durable settlement. It sounds like they did it because they did it so last minute. So I'll just let you talk about that boundary setting, because again, that seems to be so important as part of the.
So it actually, they kind of kicked the can down the road, the Peel commissioners did, because they basically, in the last 10, 12 pages of the commission, they say, okay, we think partition is the best solution, but we haven't had the time or resources to get into the details. We suggest that you send a technical commission to work that out. This is what's known as the Woodhead Commission, which is far less known than the Peel Commission. It's a less impressive report, actually, and that second report is kind of is written backwards. The kind of foregone conclusion of the Woodhead Commission by this point, by the time that it's sent to Palestine, is that this is unworkable. So they basically sent the Woodhead Commission to explain why it's not workable, and they came up with several different maps that you're referring to. So the nitty gritty was in many ways an afterthought of the Royal Commission. Yeah.
James, the Woodhead Commission is on our reading list. Have you had a chance to look at it?
I just actually started, so thank you for that.
That'll help you with your sense of how they're thinking about making these decisions.
Right. Okay. Great. Thank you.
All right.
Very few people have ever read the Woodhead Commission, so you'll be a pioneer, even 80 years later.
That's not true. Tom, your question.
Sorry, at this point, it could be going a long way back to Jonathan's point about land bought fair and square. But maybe I can try and turn it into something kind of more general, because without wanting to align myself at all with any of the sort of settler colonial narrative vendors, I kind of wanted to put a case that by modern standards there would be something to object to these land purchases. Sorry, that's my dog joining in now. Because in a modern state, it's common to have restrictions on foreign ownership and to regulate these kinds of things, and particularly in the kind of situation that the Palestinians would have found themselves in. You might think that would be a sensitive issue, but the Palestinians faced a real challenge of collective action, which is you could have 90% of people thinking that it was a bad idea to sell prime land to incomers, particularly incomers who have a plan, and yet it's notoriously difficult to stop people paying a price, and the way that we usually solve that is by passing laws or and restricting this kind of thing. But of course the Palestinians weren't in a position to do that because it was the British who actually exercised the mandate. So
of something, I don't think I know the answer to this question. Were the people living there, the Palestinians and the Jews, when they were issued passports, what citizenship did they have? Mandate?
Palestinian. Palestinian. Yeah. Yeah,
So,
they had, yeah.
So Jews, when they landed, when they got off the boat, were they instantly Palestinian citizens?
I don't know if instantly. I think if there was this whole elaborate process for certificates, right, which the British, this is also unique to Palestine, where the British Palestine administration, in conjunction with the Jewish Agency, the British would announce every, I think, 6 months, would announce how many certificates were going to be available. And then working with the Jewish Agency and sometimes others, sometimes even the revisionists, they would choose which organizations got these certificates to divvy out. And this was just a constant negotiations. The Jews were constantly disappointed and the British were constantly. And so I think if as a Jewish immigrant, you came legally, then I believe you got a Palestinian citizenship quite quickly.
So that, Tom, that in a sense, that answers your question. They're not selling it to foreigners.
But
Right,
equally, isn't that regulation of citizenship is also is in control of the British rather than in control of the Palestinians?
Well, yeah, the British
So
are the power, but
Yeah.
again, in this kind of strange hybrid situation where the Jews also have a seat at the table. Interestingly, the British, Herbert Samuel, offered the Arabs an Arab agency as a counterweight to the Jewish agency, but the Mufti and others rejected it because they didn't accept the Jewish agency. But that's another topic. Your question, Tom, about land sales is a good one. And there's a certain irony in the fact that one of the Mufti's main demands when the revolt begins is a ban on land sales. He's demanding that the British ban his fellow Arabs from selling the land. Right? There's no coercion here. He's basically admitting that people are making a lot of money off of this. His fellow Arabs are making a lot of money, and that this needs to be banned. And the British response was basically, we can't stop private individuals from selling their land. Until 1939 in the White Paper, this is the first time that the British agree that this problem has gotten out of hand. That, I mean, they had their own interests at that point in terms of quote unquote appeasing Arab and Muslim public opinion. But that's the first time in 39, the first time in the entire mandate that they basically say, okay, in this part of the country, land sales will be allowed for this many years, and in this part of the country, they will be banned. Yeah.
And that gives the lie to their earlier denial that was possible, right? It would always have been possible.
Well, anything is possible when you're the government. You can pass any law that you want, but this was like the Arabs would come to the British again and again and say, you need to ban this, and they would say, well, talk to the people who are selling the land. This is a fair and square. This is a deal between a buyer and a seller. This is not our place. Yeah.
Andre, your hand is up.
Oh yes, my next question will surely quite fit well to this one, because there was this Homa Migdal movement, which I think after the white paper was issued, was a legal loophole from the Ottoman era, where the Jews set up a stockade and a watchtower and could grab some land. I think during the Arab Revolt, they created about 50 settlements or something like that.
Yeah.
In that fashion.
Yeah. It's a very, very good question. Homa Migdal, usually translated as wall and tower and stockade campaign. This begins really after the Peel Commission, and once there's this idea that the land will be divided, and of course the Jews wanted to stake claims wherever they could. And so there was this old Ottoman law that if you put up a structure within 24 hours, if you put up a structure overnight, it couldn't be taken down. And so the Jews took full advantage of this, and dozens of these wall and tower settlements spring up starting in late 36. And this gets back into the question that Tom just asked. The Arabs would come to the British and say, complain about this tower and stockade campaign, and the British would say, look, if you've sold the land, people are allowed to build on the if the law says that within 24 hours a structure can go up, then it can go up. That's we can't stop people from going and taking advantage of laws that exist. So short of changing the law, which they weren't prepared to do, this was legal. And so the Jews were extremely effective, extremely organized at squeezing the most out of the system that was in place in Palestine. And of course, the Arabs were much less organized, had much less facility with the English language for the most part. The Mufti, for example, never learned English, just to give you an idea. Right? The Mufti is the obvious, clear, indispensable leader of Arab Palestine. He doesn't speak English, right? Whereas the Jews have English speakers, German speakers, Russian speakers in abundance, right? They're extremely well organized, and the Arabs just had never had anything to match it on that scale.
By the way, that Turkish law, it's not a law anymore, but it's certainly a tradition. If you put it up at night, you get to keep it. It's called gecekondu, and it's why whole Turkish cities collapse in earthquakes.
Wow. Yeah, I've forgotten about your Turkish expertise, Claire. I should be asking you about the Ottomans.
I don't know anything about the Ottoman presence in Palestine. I really don't. I just know what they think of it now, and I know that it's not accurate. Tim, you have your
Room can go first.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment about the Palestine citizenship and the passports. Anybody can look up mandatory Palestine passport on Wikipedia. They were British passports, and the residents of Palestine who had Palestine citizenship were considered British protected persons. That's all I'm saying. It's on Wikipedia.
Did that allow?
And they have an image of the passport as well from 1920s.
So did that allow them? Does a British protected person have the right to go to Britain, or
Absolutely not. Absolutely. Well, at that time there were at that time, yes, but they weren't British citizens. And we know going much later that the Indians of Uganda, I'm going back to when they were expelled by Idi Amin in 1972, they had British passports, but they did not, they were a particular kind of British passport that did not allow them the right to enter Britain. But that's much later.
Were Hong Kongers considered British protected citizens or British protected?
I think
yes, but they do not have the right either.
They were British subjects,
yeah.
I believe.
Yeah. The British system is much different than the French system. If you are if you are born in New Caledonia, which is probably the most autonomous of the, various French overseas territories, you are as much of a French citizen as if you were born in New Orleans-sur-Seine.
Yeah.
The French system, and probably Arun is more of an expert, but the French system of citizenship, as I've always understood it, is there is one French, at least I don't know of countries that became independent from France, but there's much more of a system of, there's one definition of French citizenship.
Well,
and
that was the case after the Second World War, but not before.
Yes, correct. Yeah. But in Britain, that is still not the case, technically.
Algeria was a part of France from 1848 and legally a part of France, but Algerian Muslims were not French citizens until 1946, unless they naturalized. So just detail.
Tim, did you have a question? Because your hand is still up.
Yeah, my question was going to be, well, one comment I was going to make, and this was a follow-up to Tom's. It actually isn't my question, but I think it's an interesting example to point out. In Canada, the British was still essentially negotiating what we would now call one-sided treaties with the various Native American or indigenous, what Americans would call Indian tribes. In Canada, they don't like to use the. They were still negotiating essentially treaties to get access to their land in return for, made up promises. They were still doing, we think of that as a 19th century thing. The British, and I guess at that point you could really say it was really more the Canadians than the British but they were doing that into the 1930s. So that there's an overlap, like Treaty Number 9 and Treaty Number 10, Treaty Number 11 in Canada, where they signed these kind of one-sided treaties with different Indian tribes. That was going on right up, into the very early time period of what was happening in Palestine. So if you think of it about it at the level of the British Empire in London, with all these, outposts, whether it be Canada or Palestine or Australia or India, they were still kind of doing these, the modern conception of like not allowing land sale. They were still trying, kind of doing these.
Is there a question
now consider. No, okay, so that was my comment. My question is for Owen. Oren is. There's a mention in David Lloyd George's testimony that the Germans and the Central Powers were going to release their own version of the Balfour Declaration.
Correct.
Yeah. If the British did not, they were about to do it. Do we have much history about what their version would have been, and what was the role of the Ottomans then? Because the Ottomans were allied with Germany and Austro-Hungary are, if the
Yeah.
Ottomans actually, they control that area. So the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans would have been kind of selling something that belonged to one of their allies.
Yeah, as I've never seen any actual Imperial German discussions about making their own declaration in support of the Jewish national home. I think it was maybe such a thing exists. I've never seen it. I think it was more in the minds of the British that the Germans might. I don't know if it ever actually.
I've never heard of anything to that effect.
Yeah, I think it was just the fear that they could, and maybe if the war was going badly enough, that they would risk incurring the wrath of their Turkish allies by doing so if things got bad enough. And so, yeah. And you had a question. Oh, in terms of the mandate, I think it is important to remember that the Palestine and other mandates weren't traditional colonies. There was an element of that, but there were these strange sort of hybrids in which, this wasn't like the British in, I don't know, Jamaica or something. This was the British being granted the mandate by the League of Nations. So they're governing Palestine on behalf of the League of Nations with this sort of idea that at some point in the future, these formerly subject people, in the case of these formerly subject people of the Ottomans, although again Palestine is different, would be sort of shepherded along towards eventual autonomy, independence. But again, Palestine, you had this whole separate provision of facilitating the Jewish national home. But again, it's sort of a colony. In many ways, it looks like a colony. In many ways, it's run like a colony. And yet, every year they have to answer to the League of Nations in Geneva, and they're governing Palestine on behalf of what at that time was considered the international community. So it's not just a pure colony in that sense.
Yeah, it was a Class B mandate, right?
I think Palestine was Class A, I believe, but I'd have to look into that. But Palestine was so sui generis in many ways. None of the other mandates in its class were the same because it was much more straightforward to kind of shepherd along Transjordan or Iraq to eventual autonomy and independence, whereas in Palestine you had this strange provision of facilitating the movement of people mostly from Europe, Jews from Europe to Palestine. So
experience in Transjordan at the time. I mean, in 24 they signed the deal, right?
Well, they kind of appointed Abdullah in 1921 at the Cairo conference. Churchill famously said that he created Transjordan with the flash of a pen one Sunday afternoon or something like that. Maybe Tom remembers the quote exactly, but they created it in 1921, and it was kind of offered as sort of a consolation prize to Abdullah and to the Hashemites. Abdullah's younger brother, Faisal, had been kicked out of Syria by the French, and the Hashemites had previously ruled Mecca, and they had revolted against the Ottomans with T.E. Lawrence, and we all know the story. So the British were keen to sort of give them a consolation prize, so they granted Abdullah this parched piece of land on the east of the Jordan. And initially the idea was, and revisionists to this day, Jabotinskyites claim that this was a tremendous betrayal by the British in lopping off eastern Palestine. And like so many things, it's complicated, but this Churchill's idea, in addition to granting a consolation prize to the Hashemites, was to kind of safeguard western Palestine, west of the Jordan, for the Jews, and by saying, okay, and he says as much. And so there was that twin objective with creating Transjordan: appease the Hashemites and try to safeguard, in Churchill's mind, the Jewish Zionist enterprise west of the Jordan.
I saw a hand up just a second ago. Oh, Meredith.
Yes, just to change it for a bit, I was very struck by Chaim Weizmann's comment when he was on his fifth, meeting with the Peel Commission, and he was worn down and he'd worked so hard. And finally he said, have we a right to exist? And that's the existential question, I guess, that's existed forever. And I don't know if you want to take that on or not.
Also, his prophetic comment about 6 million Jews need a home.
Yeah, it's chilling. It's chilling, those prophetic comments. That's Weitzman was another character here who I wanted to try to help rescue from not obscurity, but in the Israeli mind, Weitzman is remembered as the first president of Israel, but that's really an epilogue to an extraordinarily accomplished career. He was the face and the muscle of Zionism for 30 years. Ben-Gurion was barely known outside of Palestine until 1947. Really, it was Weitzman who was the face of Zionism. And he was just an extraordinarily charismatic, persuasive person who, by the sheer force of his personality, I think managed to convert countless, probably hundreds or thousands of Brits and other non-Jews to at least a greater sympathy with Zionism, just through the force of his personality and the force of his eloquence. He's just an incredibly compelling character. And yeah, those I think those initial testimonies that he made to the Peel Commission really set the stage for their conclusions that they reach of this radical idea of a Jewish state with everything that means, a sovereign Jewish state.
How would you compare Herzl and Weizmann as personalities?
By all accounts, Herzl was, by most accounts, was quite a tortured individual in his way, quite eccentric, workaholic, maybe even a little obsessive. Whereas Weitzman was very much more, Weitzman was really just a tremendous people person. He was just incredibly good with people. He had this kind of magical charisma that none of the other Zionist leaders had. Most of the other Zionist leaders, the Brits tended to look at them as, a bit vulgar, a bit pushy, a lot of the kind of Jewish stereotypes, right? That they didn't really take them all that seriously. They found them slightly annoying. But Weitzman's Rolodex was just astonishing. I've seen, his day planner, and he has breakfast with the Archbishop of Canterbury, and then he has lunch with Lloyd George at his cottage. It's incredible.
So who plays him in the movies?
Yeah. What's that guy's name? Lieb Schreiber?
Who?
He plays the guy who plays Kissinger in the Golda movie. Have you guys seen the Golda movie?
Have you seen it?
Good. It's quite good. It's quite good. I'm told by historians of the Yom Kippur War that it's actually pretty accurate. So,
well, who would be your dream casting for that role?
For Weitzman, Ben Kingsley. I think there's actually a resemblance there. Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say so.
Yeah, maybe. I guess.
So anyway, all this is to say that I think that testimony from Weitzman, where he speaks so passionately, really reached the hearts of the commissioners in many ways, particularly this one Professor Coupland, who really carries the torch. He really sort of leads this charge towards this two-state solution idea. So yeah, again, this is another instance in which, by the force of his personality, by the force of his persuasion, his eloquence, Weitzman is able to drag the Zionist movement forward.
You say that he's been forgotten, but I hadn't realized that, because he always seemed to me such a large personality, and I guess there's the Weitzman Institute, and he's lots of stuff named after him.
True.
Yeah.
He's often the Balfour Declaration is often presented as a sort of gift from Lloyd George to Weitzman, because Weitzman was a chemist, hence why the Weitzman Institute is named after him. He was a very accomplished chemist, and he created this process for producing acetone, which is extremely useful to the British war effort, extremely. And the idea was that the idea by, I think, many Israelis was that the Balfour Declaration was a thank you for that. And both Weitzman and Lloyd George strenuously pushed back against this idea that the Balfour Declaration was a party gift for Weitzman's efforts.
Now, why was Ben-Gurion understood to be the leader? By what process did that happen?
Well, he was the head of the Jewish Agency, which is another sort of strange, sort of hybrid organization that only existed in Palestine. But he comes to Palestine very early. He comes in 1906 to Palestine from Poland, and in the 20s he becomes the leader of the Histadrut, the labor federation, the Zionist labor federation, and then by the 30s, particularly by the early mid 30s, he's the head of the Jewish Agency. He's head of he's really in many ways he's the most important figure in the Haganah, and remains very important in the Histadrut, and he's he rises through the ranks of labor Zionism, and just becomes the central figure in Jewish Palestine by the mid 30s, and the relationship between him and Weizmann is also really fascinating. Weizmann had a lot of contempt for Ben-Gurion, actually, and and this isn't. You can see it in his letters. You can, if you read Weizmann's autobiography, Trial and Error, which is highly recommended. It's really fascinating. He doesn't mention Ben-Gurion until page like 450, and it's very clear that Weizmann considers himself, with much justification, to be the prime mover behind Zionism, and Ben-Gurion is a latecomer who steps in, in the late 40s.
Intellectual contempt, or was it?
They had Ben-Gurion always admired Weizmann, so it was really but as Weizmann got older, Ben-Gurion considered him unreliable, and he considered him unreliable, and he would get Ben-Gurion considered that Weizmann, when he would get into these kind of trances of the kind that charmed the British so reliably, that he would say things he shouldn't say, that he would get carried away, that he wasn't on message, he wasn't strategic, that he would be carried away. And so so by the 30s and 40s, it was really a personal sort of rivalry where Ben-Gurion thought that Weizmann couldn't be trusted anymore, that it was his time to step away. And Weizmann had a contempt for Ben-Gurion. There's a certain point where he says he's not fit to be a shoe shiner, let alone prime minister of a country. This is in those crucial years. I think this was 47, 48. But once Ben-Gurion successfully leads the War of Independence, I think Weizmann recognizes that he's a real leader. But it's only at that point. It's only very late in the game.
Kathy, you had your hand up. Is it Kathy? Lynn? Kathy. Yeah. It's Kathy, right?
Amy.
Amy. Sorry. I knew it ended with a Y sound, and I knew it wasn't.
A for Amy.
A for Amy, that's right. I was really interested in the section on Churchill, kind of blown away by his views, and that you documented in that section. And I was wondering, was that transcript his personal copy of the transcript? Because it said that he wanted to make clear that should never be revealed publicly. I was interested to know whether biographers have written about that document, or are you the first person? And also, how does it align with other public statements that he made? Because it just really blew me away.
Yeah. Churchill, in his secret Peel Commission testimony and elsewhere, makes quite clear that he does not have a lot of respect, shall we say, for the Islamic religion. He does not have a lot of respect for Arabs and Muslims generally. He does have a lot of respect and esteem for Jews and for Judaism. Of course, this is a simplification, but broadly, I think that's true. And for Zionism, he's for most of his life, he's once Zionism appears on the British cabinet table, he's for the most part supportive. And he says some things about Arabs and Muslims that in this day and age are considered unsayable. And Claire, did you want to pipe in there?
Well, he's often misquoted when he talks about gas. I mean, that's not suggesting tear gas, not poison gas. But go ahead. Sorry.
And he compares them to the quote unquote Red Indians, and basically says that he has no regrets over white people pushing out quote unquote Red Indians from America, and similarly the Jews in Palestine. And a lot of kind of pro-Palestinian activists have pointed to this to say, look, this is a colonial enterprise. This is just like whites and natives in America. And in terms of that testimony, I believe it hasn't been widely published, but it has been published. It was in Martin Gilbert, his official biographer, I believe included it in, although it may have been, on page 800 of volume 17 of Churchill's collected works, because Gilbert was always, he was a very serious historian, but he was also clearly very pro-Churchill. And I think there's some historians think that he went a little too easy on Churchill. So he published it, but I don't think he made that much of it, Gilbert. Yeah, what I discovered, this is another thing that, this is getting back to Lloyd George, but Weitzman was coaching Lloyd George about what to say to the Peel Commission. If memory serves, Churchill was also in touch with Weitzman. This is feeding into this idea of the Jews pulling the strings. All of this very pro-Zionist stuff that Lloyd George was saying, I discovered that he was corresponding with Weitzman, and Weitzman was basically reminding him of how everything went down. And again, if memory serves, I'll have to go back and check, but I think Weitzman and Churchill were also very much in touch before Churchill's testimony. But that's not to say that Weitzman was feeding Churchill lines, although he seems to have been with Lloyd George to an extent. Churchill had a very sharp memory. He knew exactly what he wanted to say. But yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
I have a question about the archives. Are we expecting anything else to be declassified? Is this it?
Well, given that there's this 80-year rule, I suspect that when 80 years pass since 47, 48, there'll be some interesting stuff to come out.
That'll be interesting.
I don't think it's an 80-year, the standard rule is 30 years.
Right.
Anything that's considered sensitive, they keep back, and they basically review every decade. And this is often
every decade.
Dying.
Okay.
So once everyone's dead, then the next decade of history will come out.
So there could be more from this period that they've decided is still too sensitive. Is that possible?
I think it's possible. But obviously they don't itemize the things they decided not to release.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense, because there were other documents I found that were declassified in 2017, which were from 1917, which were from when the British arrived in Palestine, like that document in which they kind of who's who in Palestine. It's really fascinating stuff, and it was declassified 100 years later, so that makes sense. That 10 years.
Yeah. So we can still find out a lot more about this.
Discussions of the abdication in whenever it was 36, that would none of that would come out until everybody involved was dead.
Right. Yeah. Well, it was that very short-lived monarch, Edward VIII, who in his 5 minutes on the throne sent the royal commission to Palestine. So
it makes perfect sense that releasing this stuff could still be prejudicial to British interests.
Right.
Yeah.
It'll cause great offense in many parts of the world. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's even more in there. How comfortable were you with Arabic language archives?
So my Arabic isn't as good as my Hebrew, but I can muddle through.
Really?
In Hebrew I'm fluent. I was a translator at Haaretz for quite a few years. In Arabic I'm pretty good. I'm okay. I can, with a dictionary and a bit more time, I can usually muddle through.
Where do you learn Arabic?
I first started in after college here in the States, and then I continued in Jerusalem and East Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and I did a lot of self-study, and it's a very difficult language, but I put in quite a few years. I'm always dissatisfied with. I always wish I'm always thinking my Arabic should be better, but I can muddle through. And so, but there's no Palestinian archive. There's a certain amount of Arabic material in the British National Archives and in the Zionist archives. But yeah, there's no equivalent. There's no archive in Ramallah that you can go to the way you can go to one in Jerusalem or in London.
Same problem. I was looking for Palestinian think tanks to add to our list yesterday.
But the Mufti's memoirs, for example, haven't been translated into English, which is just stunning. So when I quote the Mufti looking back, that's that I had to translate that from Arabic, for example.
That is remarkable that they haven't been translated, given how significant he is as a figure. Jonathan,
yeah.
oh, sorry, excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that was it. That was it. I have no explanation for why it hasn't been translated.
Jonathan, you have your hand up.
I do, but I think Karina had it first.
Karina? I don't see Karina. Oh, she's on the other page. Ah, Karina, excuse me. Yes, Karina.
Hi, thank you for coming, Oren. I have a pretty simple question. When I was reading the book, I kept trying to find a point where it could seem like things could go the other way, where the Arabs, the Palestinian Arabs wanted to live in peace with the Jews and wanted to establish a state next to them or live with them in the same state. Because in your introduction, you write that I forgot who says it, but Jews are like salt. You can't have too many in the bread, but you can have just a little, and it's very good. And then there are parts where you talk about how Arabs protect Jews from massacres in Hebron, and as a result, Jews are not totally annihilated from Hebron. But then there's also parts where Ben Gurion goes to meet with Alami's father-in-law, and he's, treated with a lot of contempt and derision. And he's like, oh, forget it, this experiment's a failure. And I'm wondering, was there ever a point where one could have been, whether the contempt and derision Arabs felt for Jews at this point in time, when did it all really begin? Is this a very ancient Judeophobia? Is this a recent anti-Semitism? Is there any point in trying to even answer such a question? Who are the Palestinian intellectuals other than Alami who would have actually, if they had met Ben Gurion, for example, would have responded more positively? Yeah,
very good questions. Well, I think George, I read in the book, George Antonius, the famous Arab intellectual, Lebanese Palestinian intellectual, had quite a few meetings with Ben Gurion, and it's not totally clear why those meetings fizzled out, but Antonius showed a certain readiness to consider a Jewish canton, I think is how they phrased it. There's some historians who think this was just a ruse, just to feel out Ben Gurion for his intentions, but Antonius actually didn't mean to follow through with it. But Antonius and Alami were both willing to accept again, if memory serves, I wrote this, it's been 6 years since I first started writing this book, 7. They've both certainly welcomed the white paper. And again, if memory serves, they were both willing to consider at least the Peel partition plan as a basis for negotiations. Now, you asked about anti-Semitism, Arab Muslim Judeophobia, shall we say. I think the comment about the salt is from Musa Alami's father, who was it was Tahir Faidi al-Alami, who was mayor of Jerusalem. Yes, and and he was talking with a early Zionist by the name of Jacobson when he made that comment. And Jacobson says, well, you've got it all wrong. We don't want to be the salt. We want to be the bread. It's a great quote. And so, somebody once said, maybe Claire knows, somebody said demography is destiny. This is a quote.
Is it not Oswald Spengler?
Possibly. Yeah, that sounds about right. And, I think it was so much of the Arab-Israeli conflict is complex and nuanced and multi-layered, but some of it is just relatively straightforward. And I think then and now, in many ways, the bottom line is who's the majority? Who's got 51%? And, sometimes people point to the early 20s as kind of a relative golden era for the mandate. Despite violence in 1920 and 21, most of the decade until 29 was relatively peaceful. But that's in large part because the Jews were in relatively small numbers, and they were the salt in the bread, and they were cleaning up, draining swamps, and there was a clear improvement in the land, and their numbers were not considered too threatening. But once Hitler comes to power in early 33, other anti-Semitic movements are on the rise in Europe, and Jewish population is just spiking. right? In 1935, Jewish immigration reaches 60,000 in a year. That's double the year before. And the Arabs are perceptive enough, not just the elites like the Alamis and the Husseinis and the Hashibis, but even subsistence farmers in the countryside, many of whom are still illiterate in this period. They're perceptive enough to recognize that the face of the land is changing, and that if things continue this way, the Jews will be a majority before long.
Had the Jews had done anything to make themselves more welcome? I mean, there is one British administrator said they don't seem to realize the need to be gracious to the Arabs. Guests here.
Yeah. There's a real cultural clash.
Mhm.
And Herbert Samuel, in his testimony, in addition to his rather weak defense of appointing the Mufti, he says again and again, much more convincingly, that he believes the Jews have never taken the Arab question, the Jewish leadership has never taken the Arab question seriously enough. And again, there's a risk of reading history backwards, and of us thinking, well, of course, that's the primary question, of course. And but for many of the Jews at that time, the primary question was the British question, and getting concessions out of the Brits and bringing more immigrants over. Now, you'd think they would have been dexterous and smart enough to know that both the British question and the Arab question are important, and neither can be neglected, and that in the long term, the Arab question is going to be more important. But in the case of Ben-Gurion, I think after his failed negotiations with Alami and Antonius, he kind of said, okay, there's no potential here at the moment, so it's just not worth my time. And maybe in the future when we're stronger, there'll be something to talk about. And he does come back to it later in the 40s, 50s, 60s. He comes back to the Arab question. Yeah, that's my long-winded way of saying that yes, certainly many British officials thought that the Jews were not sufficiently gracious. Herbert Samuel says that the Jews are not just, it should have been obvious that this project that they were pushing forth was one of the greatest delicateness rather, the greatest delicateness and sensitivity, and that the Jews did not sufficiently appreciate the sensitivity of what they were trying to do.
Well, they were quite invested in the idea of a land without a people for a people without a land. So perhaps they didn't want to think too much about the Arabs around them. But also I'm thinking they would have been about my grandparents' age, and my grandparents were German Jews, so they were very snobby to begin with. But I wonder if all European Jews wouldn't have been just, they would have thought these people, they have no culture, there's nothing interesting here, we don't have to take them seriously. I would assume that that attitude is prevalent. They're not educated, they don't play the piano.
Well, a lot of them did in the cities, at least, but did play the piano and went to the theater and everything. But yeah, I think there was a certain amount of that sentiment, and a certain amount of sentiment that once they see which way the wind is blowing, once they see that there's nothing they can do, that they'll come around. It's this kind of iron wall idea of Jabotinsky, that once they see they can't beat us, they will accept reality. I think Ben-Gurion and the mainstream Zionists, in this period, their views on the Arab question become much closer to Jabotinsky's views. That it's
notable that there's so little interaction between the two communities. That they're just not, they're not going bowling together. They're not building.
Well, I think there's quite a bit more before 1936, and this is when this kind of segregation between the two communities really becomes much more pronounced. I would agree there probably aren't that many Jewish and Arab friends going bowling together, but there is if you go to a mixed city in Israel today, if you go to Jerusalem, you go to Haifa, you go to Jaffa, there's interaction on a daily basis all the time, inevitably. And I think there was a lot of that in this period. Sure. You had your acquaintances, the people you bought from in the store. You had maybe even your doctor, your pharmacist. There was interaction, a lot of interaction.
Not so much that they really understood what Zionism was. I mean, if they were thinking of it in strictly religious terms. Rachel, I saw your hand up. Rachel?
He sort of answered my question while he was talking. I was wondering, we're talking about the sort of culture clash between educated European Jews and the Arabs who, were maybe not as educated. and the cultural differences and the clash there. Is that something that is still in play today? I mean, the Jews have been there for several generations now. Are they more of a Middle Eastern group now more than they were? And how does that change how they interact with the Arabs today?
Well, my friend and colleague Mati Friedman has written about this quite a bit, and the kind of the way that Israel of today is just far more Middle Eastern. The Jews of Israel today are far more Middle Eastern than in my, both of my parents are Israeli, Ashkenazi Israelis. My mom was born in Poland. My dad was born in June 48 in Israel, and it's, clearly demographically, Jewish Israelis. The plan of Ben Gurion and Weizmann and company was not that half of Jewish Israelis, perhaps more, be from the Middle East. That was not the idea. In the period that I'm writing about, the Jews of the Muslim world, of the Middle East, North Africa, are really a footnote. They almost never talk about them. It's just not on their radar. The goal, the objective, the struggle is to bring the Jews of Europe to Palestine. And there was a smattering, there was a smattering of Yemenite Jews in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and elsewhere. There was the Sephardic community in Jerusalem, Tiberias, but it was very much an afterthought.
Were they even aware that there were Yemenite Jews?
They were aware because there had been Yemenite Jews in Palestine since the since the late 19th century, I believe, in Jerusalem, and they were, the Yemenite quarter of Tel Aviv is one of the oldest neighborhoods in Tel Aviv, for example. They were aware, but in this period before the Holocaust, this was about 10% of the Jews of the world in the Middle East, and 90% were Ashkenazi. And so after the Holocaust, everything changed, and there weren't the people simply weren't there. There weren't enough European Jews to, even if every one of them wanted to come to Israel, there weren't enough. And then, of course, the Jews are driven out of the Arab and Muslim worlds, of course, as we know. And so the demographics of Jewish Israel are just completely different from what the planners had intended.
Yeah.
And the culture reflects that. It's not just, it's not like back in the day when my parents would listen to Chava Alberstein and, all these Ashkenazi crooners, and the Iraqis would listen to their thing. It's not like that now. My Ashkenazi cousins listen to the same music as their Moroccan Israeli friends and their Yemenite Israeli friends. The food is much more, the attitude, the values are just much more Middle Eastern than they were in certainly the period in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Yeah. There's just much more, it used to be a big deal when Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Israelis got married. Now it's just completely normal, happens all the time. Nobody bats an eye. So I hope I've answered your question. Yeah. But I do. It's a much more Middle Eastern country than its founding fathers would have expected.
Jonathan, you had your hand up.
Sorry, I just had a really quick follow-up to what Oren answered, if I could pose it really quickly, just in 30 seconds. Yeah, Oren, just now you said that in sum, it's a demographic question. It's a question of who's the majority. And I return back to your book because I'm not too sure. On page 50, you write, when Ben Gurion meets his hosts, Arslan Bolt, the Jews could try building their national home behind British bayonets, but the Arabs could never agree to such a thing. A Jewish majority state, even in an Arab federation, was a dream. And to me, it seems that even if demographically they were a minority in an Arab federation, the presence of a Jewish state would still not be tolerated. So I'm wondering, is it really just a demographic question? Is there something else going on?
So yeah, I think it depends who the Arab leaders of the time would have been. Look at Lebanon. Lebanon was meant to be in many ways a Christian version of Israel in many ways. It wasn't said so explicitly, but that was basically the idea. And I think, I think there were certain Arab leaders who would have perhaps been able to swallow a Jewish canton in, along the coast, perhaps, again, as part of an Arab federation. I don't think someone like the Mufti would have accepted that, but there were other Arab leaders who might have, again, as part, not as a state, but as a kind of autonomous district, right? There were all kinds of other proposals floating around at the time of a Druze, canton, a Druze state in the Golan or in Syria. Lebanon was essentially meant to be, Mount Lebanon was meant to be kind of a Christian zone. But I think you could have potentially found some Arab leaders who would have accepted that sort of thing, but a state was always a red line. But again, until the British had a lot of clout, and when they proposed it in 1937, there were prominent Arabs who accepted it temporarily before realizing that they were risking their own lives.
Why was a state a red line like that? What was it? What did they imagine a state would allow the Jews to do?
Well, so one of the questioners earlier asked about, I think it was Jonathan, or James asked about this idea of transfer, and this is I think many Arabs in Palestine had the view that it was us or them, and that if the Jews create a state, that means we're gonna be driven out of here, if not not worse. And in the Peel Commission, again, this is like one line in the Peel Commission. They say basically, and also, by the way, we recommend a population transfer. But the next commission, the Technical Commission can figure that out. And and it has to be said, as I say in the book, that Ben Gurion and Weizmann were quite excited by this prospect, that we can have an actual Jewish majority, strong Jewish majority. And but the British, pretty quickly after the report is released, they make clear that transfer is off the table, and the Woodhead Commission basically dispenses with that idea. But some of so I think that is probably why it was a red line in many ways, was that the idea was a Jewish, people couldn't conceive what it would mean to be an Arab in a Jewish state. Would that mean we'd have to become Jewish? Would that mean we'd have to leave?
Yeah. Was there, before 1936, was there ever a serious proposal for a Lebanese style confessional system?
Not exactly the Lebanese style, not to the extent of like the president is this denomination, the prime minister is this denomination, I don't believe. But there were various proposals for executive committees, legislative bodies that would have kind of proportion. There were various formula where they tried to kind of, on the one hand, this was a major Arab demand, it was kind of popular representation. A legislative assembly that would reflect the demographics of the country in this period, which were still at least 2/3 Arab, if not more, probably 70% Arab. And the British tried to split that baby in many different ways, of kind of having a committee in which you have, something like 5 Arabs, 3 Jews, and 2 Brits, or something like that. So in that sense, they kind of dabbled in confessionalism, but these proposals didn't usually come to fruition.
And I assume that after 1936, it seemed completely impossible.
Yeah, after 1936, they started talking about the clean cut.
Right.
And we just need to separate these two populations because a common, quote unquote, Palestinian nation has not arisen and is not going to arise. A common Palestinian identity is not going to happen. So we have to separate them.
Jonathan, you had your hand up.
Yes, it seems to me that both sides, the Israelis and the Palestinians, invest a lot of credence into the 2 documents that we briefly mentioned before, the Balfour Declaration and the McMahon-Hussein letters. And just seems strange to me, and I would ask, why do you think these 100-year-old documents by an empire that largely no longer exists are so important, figure so much into the current narrative?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it's pretty central, I think, to the Palestinian narrative that the British double dealed and they double promised, and that they promised Palestine to the Jews in 1917, but earlier in the Hussein McMahon correspondence, they had promised it to us. And the British, McMahon himself and Lloyd George and others insisted that for years afterwards that Hussein McMahon was a correspondent during World War I, in which McMahon, a British official, maybe you guys already know this, but he had correspondence with Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca, and so in the St. James's Conference in 1939, God, I'm really getting in the weeds here, but I feel like you guys know this stuff already. Part of the St. James Conference was a committee to examine Hussein McMahon. This was a kind of subcommittee that the Arabs demanded, especially Antonius, and they got. And the kind of conclusion that the British reached is that we didn't intend to include Palestine in this promise to the Arabs, but we should have been clearer about that. And because of the heat and fog of war, that message was not relayed. So, but they went quite a bit further in the direction of Arab opinion in this commission by saying, yeah, we should have been, this was not made clear enough. This is actually a big part of Antonius's book, and his argument is that there was double dealing.
It's an interesting question why people remember certain things as being critical, why that becomes part of a contemporary narrative. And I think has your book made any kind of ripples among Palestinians at all?
Well, the book has been translated to Arabic, believe it or not. It's available on ebook for free download in Arabic. That was made possible by an NGO called Ideas Beyond Borders, based here in New York. So it's out in Arabic and it's not out in Hebrew. So
it's not out in Hebrew.
No, it's never. I'm hoping it will be, but
well, of course it has to be in Hebrew.
You'd think so, but I've been informed there's interest from a big Israeli publisher, but they need me to help raise funds for the translation. So if anyone knows anybody. It's not a huge amount of money, but it's more than I've got. So
it must be translated into Hebrew. It's so important.
You think so? It's going to be out. It's in the works in Korean. It's already out in Arabic. There may be a German edition, but Hebrew not yet.
I'm a little shocked to learn that their publishers aren't battening down the door.
It's barely, life is full of surprises. The interest has far exceeded my expectations in the US of this book, but in the UK, very little. And in Israel, it's it's known among the Anglos in Israel to an extent, but in the Hebrew, Israelis, most of them won't read it.
Surprising. It suggests something. It suggests something. I'm not quite sure what it suggests, but it does
cheapness. It suggests cheapness. That's what it suggests.
I'm sure it would sell out its advance. Scott, you have your hand up?
I had a number of questions, but some of them I think we've sort of touched around, and I'm just wondering, as I think we're kind of coming to the end, and Oren, you have been so generous with your time. It's been incredibly interesting. The whole thing is just great. So congratulations to you and Claire for creating this day.
Well, thank you very much. You guys have been the best audience I've had, so I'm happy.
My take. Claire mentioned in our last session last week that and let me translate that a little bit. If you read the Peel Commission and the stuff we've been reading, you see that this was a hot mess in the 1930s. And some of the stuff we've been reading, it could have been written last year.
Yeah.
It's a hot mess today. It's the same hot mess. History just keeps repeating itself. And so I'm wondering, is there any way that the history can be forgotten? Because the reality is Israel is not going away. The Palestinians are not going away. What happened 80 years ago and 10 years ago is behind us. How do we take these two actors and get them to look forward and to say and deal with the reality that they both have to occupy contiguous spaces? What is your view of the way forward?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for forgetting. There's if Israelis and Germans can get along with no problem at all, then as they do, then there's really no reason that Israelis and Palestinians, Israelis and Arabs can't. There's a certain amount of necessary, if not forgetting, then moving on. the world will never progress if that's not the case. There are thousands, tens of thousands of grievances out there between various groups. I agree. You can't be too beholden to history because you'll never move on. But yes, you're right. Neither people is going anywhere. The only question is how they will, if they do, find a way to live together. It's a bleak time. We haven't talked about the horrors of last month. I'm sure you guys have talked about it in other contexts. It's a bleak time. It's hard to think about negotiations proceeding anytime soon, and yet there is also cause for a lot of optimism. I think this I think
a lot of optimism.
Well, not on Israeli-Palestinian matters, but just if you zoom out for a moment, I think the Israel-Saudi track is source of tremendous optimism. I think the Abraham Accords are just a remarkable sea change. I think the Saudi-Israel track will get back on track after this is all over. So I think even in these very difficult times, it's not all doom and gloom. It's possible that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will be the last to be resolved after Israel has made peace with Saudi and with, we can hope, Lebanon that's not dominated by Hezbollah, and maybe that'll be the last one, perhaps. The claims are obviously much more overlapping in that space than between Israel and Saudi, Israel and Lebanon. So perhaps, but it's, if we are indeed wrapping up here, then I want to leave you guys with just a little tiny bit of.
That's not my job. I'll leave that to Claire.
I'm sure we can keep going for a while, but I want to make sure that everyone has had at least one chance to ask a question. Is there anyone we've neglected completely? Denise, did you have a chance?
Andre has a hand up too.
Andre?
Oh yeah, right. I almost forgot about it. What I found interesting in the Peel Commission, and we haven't talked about that, is what did the British think education would do? The Jews obviously got their own education right from the start, and they didn't want to rely on the British. And yeah, there were the Arabs, and I think the Brits didn't think a lot about that. But in retrospect, in the Peel Commission, they say something along the lines, there should have been mixed schools where Arabs and Jews would go together and get some basic education in each other's languages. And later on, they say something like that the Arab schools were greatly boosted later on in the mandate, but that the teachers were largely Arab nationalists, greatly influenced by European fascism. And I thought about the thing, I think it was in 1932 or something, the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party was created, which was largely a copy clone of the Nazi Party in Germany. They even have, to this day, a Nazi flag, just
Andre,
inverted
are you
colors.
aware of the massive spider? Are you aware there's a massive spider behind you?
I assume that was a decoration. Is that not?
That is a decoration. Actually, it's metal. It's out of metal.
Excuse me.
So, well, first of all, let me say I'm very impressed that it seems like many of you
He's
have
not
actually
alive.
have actually read the Peel report, or at least parts of it. That's very impressive. So one of the initiatives that Herbert Samuel had when he became first High Commissioner of Palestine was that he told the Arabs, that if they would designate a room or a building or build a school, that the British would provide the teacher, and apparently hundreds or thousands of them did. But then this initiative, as after Samuel left and as the years went on, this initiative fizzled out. But certainly literacy really spiked in this period among the Arabs of Palestine. And yes, there was this kind of idea expressed in the Peel Report that if Jewish and Arab kids could study together, maybe there would be some kind of shared civic sense of duty, which never really happened. The only places really that Arab and Jewish kids studied together tended to be in parochial schools, in Catholic schools, for the most part. There may have been some Anglican schools, but yeah. And those are very much the elites, of course. Musa Alami studied with Jewish kids at the Collège des Frères in Jerusalem, for example. And so, this was really, it never happened. There was never any shared sense of Palestinian identity, Palestinian in the sense of that time period. It just simply never happened. The Jews were Jews, the Arabs were Arabs, and that was that. So I think in many ways that was aspirational. That was a sort of wouldn't it be nice kind of thing, but it was never a realistic prospect. And I think the Brits came around more or less to realizing that in this period that I'm writing about.
But not inherently. We know that because Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews are really quite well integrated.
Yeah, it's honestly, when I look at the Arab citizens of Israel and I look at how that's kind of the dream, the vision that Zionist leaders, Jabotinsky and others had of Arabs in the Jewish state is being realized every day with Arabs within Israel, because for the vast majority of them, they're hardly Zionists. They wouldn't consider themselves Zionists, but they are integrated for the most part. They are, it's still relatively rare for any citizens of Israel to commit acts of terror. It happens sometimes, but it's really quite rare. Right? Even it's not, it's not this festering sore in Israel of intercommunal. Yeah, there have absolutely been difficult times. In the war of 2021, there were some very difficult scenes between Jews and Arabs. It's not been a picnic, but for the most part, I think if all those Palestinians who fled or were expelled in 1948 could see what life was like as an Arab in the Jewish state, like the vast majority of them, I suspect, would have said, "I'm not going anywhere. If I can stay here, I'm staying." I think there was just a lot of doom thinking about what was going to happen, and it's sad. It's tragic. It's tragic that there is a way for this to work, but we've got the refugee crisis, we've got refugee camps, and we've got a whole that is a festering wound that's been festering since 1947, 48.
But you say the Arab Israelis aren't Zionists, but consistently in poll after poll, they say they'd rather live in Israel than in the Palestinian
Authority. Right. Many of them, they're not Zionists for the most part, but that's not to say that very many of them aren't proud to be Israeli citizens. Yeah. This is shown in poll after poll, and anytime there's any proposal by Avigdor Lieberman or anyone else to move the Green Line to include some Arab villages in Israel in a state of Palestine, they scream, they say, hell no, we don't want to be part of a state of Palestine. And so it's only if you read the New York Times, the Washington Post, they're often referred to as Palestinian citizens of Israel. Now there's some activists in the Balad party, there are some Arab nationalists in Israel who prefer to be called that, and that's their prerogative. But for the most part, they are Arab citizens of Israel. They're Israelis. They're right. They have family across the Green Line. Of course, they identify with Palestinians, but they're part of the social fabric. Yeah.
All right. Has everyone, Denise, did you get a chance to ask a question?
I did not have a question, Claire, but thank you. I'm just absorbing.
Okay. What about you, Lucas?
The same. I'm mostly absorbing most of the question, but just Oren, thank you so much for your time. It has been really fascinating. And speaking as someone who's British, this is a part of our history that I had very little knowledge of before the classes that Claire's putting on and reading your book in particular, especially the stuff around Wingate and the way that effectively, in some respects, we sort of created what would then become the IDF later on, which was something I had absolutely no understanding or knowledge of at all. So that was it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Lucas.
And I see just two people real quickly because I can't figure out what your name is, Miss iPhone.
Is that Meredith?
Unmute yourself.
Sorry, this is Lita.
I'm sorry?
Oh, iPhone, yeah.
It's iPhone, it's Lita, who I've lost my there. And thank you very much. I am still so confused by all this, and I can't help but think that with the jihadist taking over the Muslims, I'm not saying it right, I don't see where there is much hope for there being peace together, because they, if you think about how they have taken away rights from women, it's a frightening period of time. So
It's
very
very difficult to see how you reach any sort of modus vivendi with a group like Hamas or its ilk. It's extremely difficult. I think most Israelis at this point, if not earlier, view them as something that needs to be defeated and not come to terms with.
I'm sure you've seen the incredibly depressing opinion poll suggesting that support for Hamas in both the West Bank and Gaza is about 75%.
If the polls are to be believed, it's gotten a major boost from these atrocities, which is obviously pretty discouraging. Who knows how reliable these polls are, but if it's true, it's pretty grim. It's pretty grim.
David? David? Any questions?
Yeah, can I make a comment?
Yeah, Arun.
Remember what happened during the Second World War with the American and British bombing of German cities? That only reinforced support for Hitler, and that we learned after the war.
It only reinforced what?
Support for Hitler on the part of the Germans, the American and British firebombing of German cities. So what if there are polls that showing a spike in Hamas's support in the West Bank? That was totally predictable, and on Gaza probably as well, though who knows who's polling in Gaza right now. I just want to make one quick comment. I know we're way past time about what you said about comparing the situation now to Israelis and Germany after the Second World War. Just comment, Germany was defeated, first of all. It was, and secondly, it took a couple of generations for that to happen. And I remember growing up in the 60s and the 70s, and I knew American Jews who would in the 70s, 30 years after, refused to go to Germany. In fact, I still have a friend now. He was a well-known specialist, a Middle East specialist, academic in the United States. And she went to a conference in Berlin just last year, and she said it was the first time, and it was kind of hard for her to do that. And she was raised as an Orthodox Jew in New York, and so that it took a lot of time. And when you read I'm not going to talk about the current situation. I just wanted to make that comment.
My grandparents had completely different personalities. My grandfather was this massively expansive, generous spirit, and he always wanted to go back to Germany so he could have world premieres of his compositions. My grandmother would pretend she didn't understand German.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. My mother to this day would not visit Germany. She doesn't travel much, but she wouldn't. Her family was completely devastated. She wouldn't go to Germany. It's but yeah, it takes time. It certainly takes time. Yeah.
All right, David and Cecily, I think you're the only two who haven't had a chance to speak. Quick question? I think you have to unmute.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Would you say that the Arab uprising, the 36, 39, set the pace for this kind of Arab turning on itself and never quite recovered? That what we're seeing today is just an extension of what happened from 36. Is that fair?
There's certainly, very, very strong echoes in what we see in the first Intifada, and particularly the second Intifada, of just an Arab uprising ostensibly against Zionism just turning on itself. Absolutely. I think it set a template, a tragic template in many ways, for the ways that that Palestinian opposition to the Jews ends up turning back on them. I think that's true. I think that's
figures everything. I think you've made that point in the book extremely well, that this is a microcosm and a foreshadowing of almost every subsequent dynamic.
But then also, is there any way back to any kind of solution once you have a much larger, dangerous regime like Iran actually supporting and maintaining Hamas? It seems like we're getting into a corner where there's no way out here.
Well, let's hope that the protesters in Iran eventually do the world a favor and help usher out this awful regime in the Islamic Republic. But it's, we have to be patient. The Middle East moves a lot more slowly than the West, typically speaking. But things can sometimes there can be surprises, and things can change very quickly.
Yep. Thank you.
What's next for you, Oren?
I wish I knew. If anyone has an idea, they can
It'd be
email
hard
me.
to top this.
I think, as you mentioned, I got married last month on October 7th, and I think I should probably get a real job somewhere that can pay the bills. But so I don't know. I'd love to spend my life writing books if I can find a way to make a livelihood out of it. But genuinely, if anyone, I'm very much trying to figure out my next steps, and we're trying to figure out where they're going to be. Are we going back to Israel? Are we staying here in the States? So if anyone hears about anything interesting, let me know.
I think probably it's probably sold well enough that you wouldn't have any trouble getting advance for next one.
I'd hope so. It has been selling well, and one very small silver lining to the horrors of the last.
I wasn't going to say because it sounded wrong, but
yeah, it sounds tacky when I say it, but let there be one good thing coming out of it. The interest is definitely high, and we've run out of copies on Amazon, and thankfully now they're back. So there has been a lot of interest. So
it would be a much better world if everyone with an opinion about the conflict read your book.
High praise indeed. Well, thank you very much. And this is such a great. I love this initiative of kind of Substack to actually talking face to face. I think this is a great model for hashing out difficult topics and actually communicating with human beings around the world, smart human beings. I think this is a great initiative, Claire. It's really
it's just a pleasure to have students who really want to learn. I mean, everyone here works hard and does the reading and comes prepared. And
clearly,
I give you an exam and you're doing it. It was so nice of you to come and talk to us. I learned a lot. And I think
it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. If I'm ever back in Paris, I'd love to see you, Claire. And
of course, I'd like to meet your bride too.
Yeah, absolutely. She'd love to meet you. So thank you guys so much. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you
for
Thank
being
you.
so generous with your time.
It's wonderful to hear.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey.
Excellent.
Goodbye.
Good job, Oren.
Thank you.
Thank you. This
Thank
was
you,
great.
everybody.
Excellent.
Thank you, Claire. That was wonderful.
Karina, how do I get the AI summary? I saw you're making one.
I mean, I just saw that there was a feature, and I was like, "Oh, Claire's gonna love this. She loves this. She loves experimenting with the AI." I think you just have to approve my request. Surely you can click like yes or something.
I approved it, and I'm
Okay.
too.
I think that you should be able to access it like likely after the meeting ends, and then the summary is actually generated. Yeah.
All right. What other cool things can we do here?
I just sent a request too. I hadn't seen that before.
I just enabled it.
You can do whiteboards.
Enable.
Yeah.
Turn that on before. All right. Well, we'll see what happens when I end the meeting. Okay, guys. Thank you very much for showing up.
Thank you.
And doing me
Excellent
proud.
session.
You lived up to your reputation.
Thank you for arranging. It was wonderful.
My pleasure.
Thanks. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.